The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and the ranking member, my good friend, Mr. Deutsch, for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. And without objection, your written statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. And I'd like to tell our witnesses that our parties are having their conferences right now, and they're just getting out, so I'm sure that people will be filtering in. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. The stabilization and reconstruction operations in Iraq were, at the time, the largest such project of its kind that the United States government ever undertook. But for all of the good intentions, it was a program replete with challenges, overpromises, setbacks, and shortcomings. Of course, it had its share of accomplishments and successes as well, but at the end of the day, when we look back at our approach to the rebuilding of Iraq, we're left with an overall sense that there were too many errors, that fraud was widespread, and that there was an unnecessary amount of waste of taxpayer dollars, U.S. taxpayer dollars. Not long into the Iraq conflict, it became clear that our expectations for a limited post-conflict engagement gave way to the realities on the ground, hard realities. Our mission would quickly have to shift from a short-term operation to a long-term, protracted rebuilding effort that would require large amounts of human and financial capital that we had neither the planning nor the capability to conduct. The Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction and his excellent team spent 9 years, countless hours, analyzing our efforts in Iraq in order to identify the challenges that we faced, what we did wrong, where we succeeded, and most importantly, what happened to the $60 billion in taxpayer money used to fund the rebuilding of Iraq. What was concluded painted a very grim picture of our ability to adequately plan, execute, and oversee large-scale stability and reconstruction operations. According to the Inspector General, as much as $3 to $5 billion were wasted from the Iraq Relief and Reconstruction Fund alone due to poor accountability, and as much as $8 billion overall. Many projects in Iraq ran over budget and behind schedule because of a lack of oversight and lack of accountability, like the Basra Children's Hospital. According to the Inspector General's reports, this hospital was supposed to cost $50 million, but ran over to over $165 million and fell more than a year behind schedule. Another mismanaged project was the Fallujah wastewater treatment system. The IG found that the initial $30 million project tripled in cost to nearly $100 million and only reached 1/3 of the homes originally planned. These are but a few examples, but they may prove valuable and the need for improved oversight going into the future. The lessons learned and the recommendations put forth in the Inspector General's final report, and I hope that everyone will have a chance to look at it, Learning from Iraq, a final report from the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, and all of the members have the book, serves as an important tool for the United States government and for us in the United States Congress as we find ourselves facing a shift in the post-conflict role in Afghanistan. Our efforts in Afghanistan have already replaced those of Iraq as its nation's largest ever stabilization and reconstruction operation. Among the many challenges we faced in Iraq that the Inspector General highlights were a deteriorating security situation and inadequate oversight over the projects and programs being implemented. Yet for all of the challenges that we faced and the deficiencies that we encountered, nearly all of them lead back to the fact that we did not have a proper plan in place beforehand, which hampered our ability to execute and oversee stabilization and rebuilding operations properly. We have spent nearly $100 billion in Afghanistan under similar circumstances as Iraq, yet we still find ourselves making many of the same mistakes that we cannot afford to make as we prepare to withdraw our troops from Afghanistan at the end of 2014. It is likely that the United States will find itself in a similar position when examining future reconstruction efforts. In Haiti, a recent GAO report that I commissioned illustrated the lack of coordination and inadequate use of funds between the USAID and the State Department. In Syria, we must prepare for the possibility that similar efforts may be needed in a post-Assad era as the conflict further cripples the country's infrastructure. In order to ensure that we maintain the know-how to properly plan, execute, and oversee any future similar operations, we must learn from the lessons of Iraq. We must centralize unity of command, advocate for better interagency coordination, and use our funds wiser, more efficiently, and more effectively. And with that, I will turn to my ranking member, Mr. Deutsch, for his opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman, for calling today's important hearing. It's been just over 10 years since the United States went into Iraq under false pretense of thwarting weapons of mass destruction. Nearly 4,500 brave U.S. soldiers were killed, more than 32,000 were wounded, including thousands with critical brain and spinal injuries, and over 100,000 Iraqi civilians were killed. And now I think there is an unfortunate perception that with so much upheaval in the region over the past 2 years, Iraq is no longer a priority. Yet at a cost of $2 trillion and the high human toll, we will feel the lasting effects of this war for many years. The U.S. has spent $60 billion on reconstruction efforts. It's an incredible amount of taxpayer dollars. But we did this to ensure lasting security, not just for the Iraqi people, but for stability in the region, and to try to create a reliable partner to help protect U.S. strategic interests. Even though our military operations have concluded, as we'll hear today, there are still thousands of U.S. civilian personnel on the ground working to ensure that Iraq has the security and civil society institutions necessary to sustain a successful and stable state. The United States and Iraq are working to implement all 8 tracks of the Strategic Framework Agreement. But in order to sustain long-term stability, the focus needs to be on more than just security. It must be on economic reforms, infrastructure, and rebuilding and strengthening higher education for a new generation of Iraqis. The IMF projects a GDP growth rate of 10% for 2013. Oil production is over 3 million barrels per day, helping to stabilize the markets as the U.S. and our partners can continue to find ways to shrink Iranian exports. For the first time in 2 years, there is dialogue between all of Iraq's political leaders. And although the run-up to April's provincial elections was marred with increased violence, the elections were deemed a success. However, sectarian violence has only increased with over 2,000 casualties between April and June. The greater test will come as the Parliament prepares for next year's national elections, followed by presidential elections. A peaceful transfer of power will be the true test of any democracy. In any operation of this scale, with this much money involved, we owe it to the American people to conduct stringent oversight. For the past 9 years, the Office of the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction has audited and investigated the state and DoD reconstruction operations on the ground in Iraq. According to the 220 audits and 170 inspection reports conducted by the Inspector General, Iraq reconstruction efforts have been plagued by waste, fraud, and abuse. I applaud the IG's work in securing the successful conviction of 100 fraud cases and recovery of nearly $300 million in misused assistance, but the amount wasted, we know, totals well into the billions. I'm most interested to hear from the Inspector General as to how waste and fraud can be better controlled in future stabilization. Know how waste and fraud can be prevented in future stabilization and reconstruction operations. How do we learn from this? How do we use the lessons learned in Iraq to streamline bureaucracy while ensuring better interagency coordination on reconstruction programs? How do we maintain oversight, evaluate progress, and enforce timelines of private security and civilian contractors, particularly when you had at times over 170,000 private contractors on the ground? A recent CNN report indicated that contractors have reaped a staggering $138 billion in Iraq. $138 billion. And perhaps most importantly, I look forward to hearing how we can better achieve host country buy-in. How do we operate in a situation if the U.S. is looked upon as occupiers by the people? How can we achieve this connection, not through bribery at every level of government, but with the people who will be working in the water treatment plant, or the mother who could have the chance to send her child to university? As the Inspector General prepares to wind down his mandate later this year, the title of this hearing is fitting, Learning from Iraq, because although I hope we are never involved in a contingency operation of this magnitude again, appropriate advanced strategic planning for any future efforts can mitigate the pitfalls of Iraq. The chair's focus on Afghanistan just several minutes ago, focusing on Afghanistan going forward, saving taxpayers' money, stopping fraud, stopping waste. These are all incredibly important topics that I look forward to hearing our witnesses speak about today. I look forward to what I hope will be a productive discussion on how we can apply the Special Inspector General's best practices to any future operations. I appreciate your being here, both of you, and Madam Chairman, I yield back the balance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch, for your opening statement. We will then recognize members for a 1-minute opening statement. We will begin with Mr. Kitzinger. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and gentlemen, thank you for serving your nation and being here. I appreciate it. Since I only have 1 minute, I want to just quickly say, so I'm a veteran of the Iraq War, been there multiple times over multiple years, and in fact, during that process, I saw great improvement, especially after the surge happened, which probably many people still in Congress today oppose the surge. And it was amazing to me. And then as a member of Congress, I was shocked. I was utterly shocked to find out that the administration decided that they were going to leave no residual troops at the end of, there was no negotiation of a further status of forces agreement. We're talking about the lessons we're going to learn in Afghanistan. I think that's what's important, because I just read an article today in the New York Times that the U.S. considers faster pullout in Afghanistan. In fact, they're talking about a zero troops option after 2014, which was a number that was randomly pulled out of a political generator of saying, hey, politically 2014 would be a good number. I'm very concerned that we repeat the mistakes in Iraq by pulling all troops out of Afghanistan and ending what the American people, young men and women, have fought so hard to achieve, and that the Afghan people have fought so hard to achieve on the edge of an Afghanistan victory. So with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Connolly is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Bowen and your team for your hard work. You know, the finding that at least 15% of the Reconstruction money, $8 billion, was wasted is troubling enough. But when one contemplates that, that's probably the tip of the iceberg when you look at inefficiencies, inappropriate projects, projects that half work, projects that aren't going to have lasting value or can't be maintained, that number climbs rapidly. How can we be surprised that the United States finds so much wastage based on a war that had nothing but false premises, and frankly, when the decision was made to go in, was inadequate to begin with, and the chaos that resulted has cost us dearly. And so I hope we focus on the lessons learned and enshrine them so we don't repeat them. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Dr. Yoho?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd just like to thank the Chair and the ranking members for this hearing today. This hearing is important because it gives us the opportunity to learn lessons from our past endeavors in the Middle East region and hopefully not make the same ones again. And if insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, let's hope by having hearings like this and talking to you, we can inject a little sanity to our foreign endeavors of the future. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses and thank them for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Yoho. Mr. Cicilline.
I thank the chairman and the ranking member for convening this hearing, and I certainly want to thank the witnesses for being here. I think there has been considerable national debate about our engagement in the war in Iraq, but there should be no question that we have an important responsibility to ensure that we are good stewards not only of the talent of this country, but of the treasure. And this report raises some very alarming concerns. I think, as Mr. Connolly says, it ought not be a surprise based on the false premises that led us to this conflict. But I'm very anxious to hear from the witnesses and to hear your recommendations, how we might reform this process to safeguard not only American lives, but safeguard American treasure. And I thank you for being here. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Collins is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just, again, look forward to the testimony of our witnesses today, bringing forth we've heard some of this in other committees, and I'm looking forward to that. And again, what was said earlier is looking forward with a look to the past, I think, is appropriate. I think the one thing, though, is that just frankly, I'll just, as a point of order here, and just a point to say, as we look forward in what happened as someone who also has served as Representative Kissinger in Iraq and been there, let's look at the report. Let's do what we're here to do on oversight, and let's focus on the fact that the real lives were lost, real lives were cost, and the things that are taxpayer money. And this idea that we have a false premise for going there or other things needs to be left on the table, and we need to focus on what we can learn and move ahead. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kennedy is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for holding this hearing. Thank you to our witnesses for your service and your important work. I'm just going to add my voice to, I think, the voices and the thoughts that you've heard already this morning. In reviewing the report, I join my colleagues in being particularly troubled with some of the markups and the contracting that you pointed out. Just on one page, $900 for a switch that was valued at $705, a 12,000% markup. Another bid that was put in for $80 for a piece of PVC plumbing that was also competitively bid on for $1.41, a markup of over 5,000%. What can we do? Clearly, the systems that were put in place were inadequate, to say the least. What can we do to make sure that our treasure is spent wisely and we are matching the commitment that our service members are making abroad? So I look forward to your thoughts, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Meadows is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for being here to testify. Looking back, it's disturbing to note that we've got so much waste, fraud, and abuse, and yet we still don't even really know the full extent of what happened there. And so that's troubling. The Chairwoman has pointed out that, we've seen some 15 to 20% of the $21 billion really go up in terms of wasted cost. A hospital that costs 3 times what it should have, $70 million spent on anti-corruption efforts that really didn't show any results, $70 million. And so the money is gone, but what I'm hopeful to hear today from each one of you is what we can do in terms of lessons learned. I appreciate your work. I'm also intrigued to hear the efforts that you've got in terms of creating the U.S. Office of Contingency Operations and the implementation thereof. And so I look forward to working with you to find significant ways that we can reduce waste and fraud. And with that, I yield back. Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank Madam Chair and Ranking Member for your very articulate comments. And I want to say, first of all, I'm the mother of an Iraq veteran who served willingly and proudly. He returned safely. With that said, I think it cannot be said more that the war in Iraq was the wrong war at the wrong time. The real tragedy were the lives that were lost and mangled. And I think it's very unfortunate that we even have to have this hearing today. I understand the reason for it. Madam Chair, I yield.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Cotton is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for having this hearing. There are many important lessons learned. I, too, was a veteran of Iraq. I served with the 101st Airborne and led 40 infantrymen in Baghdad. One of the hallmarks of the Army is that you always engage in self-critique, not just rewarding yourself for the good things to sustain, but exploring the failures that you need to improve in the future so you can always gain in your levels of performance. I look forward today to hearing more about what we can learn from Iraq, how we can apply those lessons to Afghanistan, and how we can apply them inevitably in the future when we find ourselves in conflict again, defending our country's values and its interests, and defending our allies around the world. I hope that we don't, unfortunately, devolve into a look backward 10 years or more into what took us to war in Iraq, but rather what America can do in the future to make America and Americans safer and make the world more free. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Vargas.
I'll get it right this time. Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Ranking Member. I appreciate very much the opportunity to speak, but also the hearing. Especially, I want to thank the witnesses for being here. The numbers are staggering, especially when we take a look at sequestration and what we have to do in the sense of cuts in our own country. So I'm very anxious to hear your testimony. Also, to find out if we really are in a better position today than we were, 10 years ago as we move forward. So again, thank you very much for being here, and Madam Chair, I yield
Thank
back.
you, sir. Mr. DeSantis.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for holding this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for coming. I just look forward to this. This is very important. There were a lot of good things we did in Iraq. When I was there, I saw a lot of very positive actions, a lot of bravery from some of our troops, and we did extend a lot of blood and treasure there, and there were some good things, and obviously there were some not so good things. So I really look forward to learning from your report and your testimony. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Meng.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, and thank you to our witnesses for your service to our country and for being here today. The Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction's report provides valuable insights into the reconstruction process in Iraq. This is an important opportunity to evaluate our previous rebuilding efforts and consider how to improve our efficiency in any future stabilization efforts. Considering all the countries in conflict around the world, it is critical that we learn from our past mistakes and failures before involving ourselves in any other reconstruction efforts. I look forward to exploring how we can use the information contained in this report to develop more effective response systems and produce better results. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Stockman is recognized.
Thank you for allowing me, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member, to speak, and it's good seeing you again after all these years. We live in a hurricane area, a hurricane zone. We would never vote for a hurricane, and we would never want a hurricane. But when it happens, we want to be prepared. It's like Boy Scouts. We want to anticipate the worst. And now we never want to be in that situation again where we're in Iraq the way we are. But it shouldn't happen again. I think it's critical we address how we can do it better. And that's what we're here about today. And I'm excited that you're addressing these issues. And I compliment you for doing all this under the fire of military while you're trying to audit at the same time. Appreciate your sacrifice to our nation. And I really look forward to seeing how we can save a dollar. I think I had the lowest dollar per vote. So this is an issue that we need to address, saving money for our taxpayers. And thank you, Madam Chairman, for opening up.
Thank you, sir. And I think that I speak for all the members when I say how blessed we are to have in our subcommittee, as you heard from our members speak, 4 veterans of the Iraq War. So for them, they have a real deep personal knowledge in what went on there. Thank you to Mr. Kinzinger. Thank you, Mr. Collins. Thank you, Mr. Cotton. And thank you, Mr. DeSantis, for your brave service. We thank you, and Ms. Frankel, for your son. And I'm blessed that my stepson and daughter-in-law also served tours in Iraq. So thank you very much to all these brave heroes. And we are so pleased to welcome back to our committee Mr. Stuart Bowen, Jr., the Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction. Mr. Bowen has served in this position since 2004. Overseeing more than $63 billion in U.S. funds. Over the past 9 years, he has made 34 trips to Iraq, and his oversight work has produced financial benefits to the U.S. government in excess of $1.8 billion and has yielded 87 convictions for fraud and other crimes. Mr. Bowen is a military veteran, having served 4 years on active duty as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force. Thank you for your service, and welcome back this time to our subcommittee. Thank you, Stuart. And next, we will welcome Ambassador John Herbst, the Director of the Center for Complex Operations at the National Defense University. Prior to this, Ambassador was the ambassador to Ukraine and to Uzbekistan, and retired in 2010 with the rank of Career Minister. He also served as the State Department's coordinator for reconstruction and stabilization, overseeing the creation of the Civilian Response Corps, an interagency group of 1,000 civil servants trained and ready to deploy quickly to crises abroad. He is a two-time recipient of the Presidential Distinguished Service Award and has also received the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award and the Secretary of State's Career Achievement Award. Mr. Bowen is here with his daughter, Sophie, and who is interning with the Veterans Affairs Committee, and the ambassador's here with 2 interns, so we welcome them as well. And Mr. Shabbat of Ohio has just come in, and I'm wondering if he has a 1-minute opening statement before we get to our witnesses.
I thank the chairwoman, but in the interest of time, I think I'll forego that so we can get to the witnesses.
Thank you so much. So we will begin with the Honorable Stuart Bowen. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, members of the committee. It is indeed an honor to appear before you again to discuss our final lessons learned report, Learning from Iraq. And on a personal note, Madam Chairman, muchas gracias por todo su apoyo durante mi trabajo en SIGAR.
Just showing off.
And it's an honor also for me to be at the table with my friend, Ambassador John Herbst, who has truly the most applicable firsthand knowledge about the attempts to address the challenges that arose in Iraq, the attempts to reform our approach to Reconstruction, and really the story of how those attempts didn't meet the mark. So thank you, John, for joining us. We issued Learning from Iraq this March, the 9th Lesson Learned Report, emblematic of my understanding of this mission from the start. And that is not just to generate audits, we did 220 of those, inspection reports, 170, and obtain convictions. We'll have over 100 by the time we're done in September. But to learn from what we were observing and to communicate it to operators so that it could be applied to improve how U.S. taxpayer dollars were being spent in Iraq. My mission, as I saw it, was as the taxpayer's watchdog, but also as a support to the mission and advisor to the operators through these reports. This report provides 7 chapters that lay out how that $60+ billion was spent over the last 10 years, but importantly concludes with 7 lessons that are the focus of today's hearing. And I think that's what we should absorb from the entire Iraq experience, what we can learn from it, how it can be applied to reforming our system for stabilization and reconstruction operations, so that when we next encounter such an operation, and we will, as most of the members have acknowledged, that we are structured to succeed, that we are prepared to win. And I have to say, in answer to an issue raised already at the dais, that we are not much better off today than we were 10 years ago with regard to planning, executing, overseeing stabilization and reconstruction operations. The 7 lessons, here they are. First, begin rebuilding only after you've established adequate security. As someone said to me, why is that a lesson? Isn't that obvious? Well, it's a lesson because we didn't apply it effectively in Iraq. And thus, to put it in very simple terms, begin modestly. Begin with small projects, and don't pursue large ones until the setting is stable. Second, ensure full host country engagement. Madam Chairman, you pointed this out in your opening statement as a key issue, underscoring the truth that we didn't consult enough with the Iraqis at the outset. For Learning from Iraq, I did 44 interviews with leadership, 17 Iraqi leaders, including Prime Minister Maliki, previous Prime Ministers Jaffrey and Alawi, and they all essentially focused on this, that we didn't consult with them about what they really needed, and thus we built what we wanted. As Deputy Secretary of State Bill Burns told me, we came to Iraq and we tried to do it all and do it our own way. And he underscores and echoes the Iraqi point, consultation is key. Third, establish uniform contracting, personnel, and information management systems, all missing in Iraq. One of our first audits, which we issued almost exactly 9 years ago, found that the Coalition Provisional Authority couldn't account for who was there. They did not have a staffing system that was apropos, which was unsurprising since it was a startup. And as I've called it in this report, it was an adhocracy, and indeed a series of adhocracies that unfolded in Iraq. That's the wrong way to protect our national security interest. Improvisation is the wrong approach. We have to plan. That's key. And personnel planning is the first and foremost element, I think, because you've got to take the right people to the situation to succeed. But also IT. Our audits repeatedly found that there was no coherent information management system in place to track what we built. Indeed, we ultimately concluded after a series of audits, only 70% of what we built was captured in any coherent information management system. Unacceptable, certainly. Contracting. The Congress has responded to the contracting challenges of Iraq. Indeed, the departments have. But have the departments responded in an integrated, effective fashion? And the answer still must be no. Also unacceptable, because if you want to talk about waste, a lot of waste occurred in poor contracting vehicle choice, poor quality assurance, poor contract management, ineffective oversight on the ground in the implementation of contracts. But the most important lesson, that these issues can be resolved by establishing an entity that would ensure civil-military integration of planning, execution, and oversight for future stabilization and reconstruction operations. And H.R. 2606, introduced by Mr. Stockman and Mr. Welch, would do that. It provides a structure. It addresses the contracting problem. It addresses the personnel problem. Indeed, it puts somebody in charge. Occam's razor. If no one's in charge, someone should be in charge. Accountability is key to success. That's the purpose of this hearing, oversight, to impose accountability. But looking forward, as the members have articulated, which we must do as we learn from Iraq, we have to implement reforms that will effectuate a success in future stabilization and reconstruction operations. The U.S. Office for Contingency Operations would assure such success. Thank you, Madam Chairman and members of the committee. Look forward to your questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Bowen. And Ambassador, we'd love to hear from you as well. Just push that green button.
Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch, members
A little bit closer to your...
Thank you for inviting me to appear today. It is a pleasure to appear alongside Stuart Bowen, my longtime colleague and the Special Inspector General for Iraq. In particular, I'm here to offer support for his suggestion to create the U.S. Office for Contingency Operations, USOCO. This discussion comes at an inopportune but a necessary moment. The country has been continuously at war since September 11, 2001. Our military has been stretched by operations in Iraq and Afghanistan to the near breaking point and needs time and resources for repair and rejuvenation. With our planned withdrawals from Afghanistan next year, the U.S. seems to be entering a new era of national security challenges. Chastened by the difficulty and costs of Iraq and Afghanistan, the American public has expressed in various polls its preference to avoid such interventions in the future. This clear preference to avoid large-scale interventions has reinforced by the nation's budgetary woes. This has put serious pressure on the federal budget and, of course, the Pentagon. In sum, there is not much support at this time for the U.S. to invest its reduced budget resources to ensure that we conduct stability operations in a competent way. This is a serious mistake because whether or not the United States is entering a new post-Afghanistan era in foreign policy, the international scene continues to be characterized by state dissolution and rampant instability. Al-Qaeda, holed up in the Taliban-led failed state of Afghanistan, launched the September 11 attacks. Today, the extremist group Al-Shabaab in Somalia is recruiting among Somali Americans in Minneapolis. The Center for Complex Operations recently released a new book, Convergence, Illicit Networks and National Security in the Age of Globalization, that highlights how various criminal groups are making common cause around the world to the detriment of law-abiding states and citizens. The Fund for Peace and Foreign Policy issued the 2013 Failed State Index last month. It listed 20 countries, with Somalia and the Democratic Republic of Congo leading the way, as in critical condition, and 20 more in serious danger. In other words, this problem of ungoverned spaces will be with us for a generation or more, and there will be contingencies when American interests and the American public demand that we act. For example, Haiti is a near neighbor that has earned its ranking as the 8th most unstable country in the world. This poorly governed land has prompted American interventions, both military and humanitarian, multiple times over the past century. Lately, these interventions have been driven by our desire both to alleviate human misery and to prevent a flood of Haitian refugees washing up on our shores. These are objectives which the American public can understand and support. I was in the State Department during our last intervention in Haiti, following the January 2010 earthquake. I recall vividly senior officials saying, "We will do this intervention right, so there will be no need for future interventions." Well, as the chairwoman pointed out, we did not do it right. Our engagement achieved little. There will be occasions in the future where we'll have to engage in Haiti. So it is a very good thing if we are prepared. There is yet one more reason to develop capacity to conduct stabilization and reconstruction operations. While the American public may be fed up with interventions abroad, many in Congress and our broader political class are not. We saw this in the run-up to the intervention in Libya. President Obama was initially reluctant to engage, but under pressure from our allies in the UK and France, and also from Congress, we decided to go in. The President put clear limits on our role. We would only use air power, and we put no soldiers on the ground. Yet this intervention was in support of a principle, the responsibility to protect helpless citizens from their own leadership, which if applied regularly would lead to our intervening again and again around the world. Right now, we are witnessing pressure to get involved in Syria. This pressure is going despite the failure of our intervention in Libya, a failure because while we removed Gaddafi and we prevented carnage by Gaddafi on his citizens, this led to the destruction of democracy in Mali and the humanitarian tragedy there with over 450,000 displaced people, both within the country and without. Yet pressure is growing for us to engage in Syria, despite the fact that the most effective members of the opposition are Salafi extremists. If we go into Syria, we better be prepared. We are not prepared at this moment. To properly run stabilization and reconstruction operations, the U.S. needs a significant civilian capacity to complement our world-class military. One way to explain our less than successful stability operations in Iraq and Afghanistan is to point out the obvious. These civ-mil operations were carried out by professionals on the military side, but by amateurs on the civilian side. This is not to denigrate our State Department professionals or our USAID professionals. I was a career Foreign Service officer for 31 years, and I can attest to you that our Foreign Service officers are courageous, intelligent, and capable. The same is true with our USAID colleagues. But the point is that neither the State Department nor USAID hires or trains people in large numbers for stability operations. This was evident during our engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes, we deployed hundreds and even thousands of USAID and State Department officers, but we eventually staffed it with tens of thousands of contractors, people who served one tour and then left. Their experience vanished with them. Contrast that with the military personnel who served 3 or more tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. The problem on the civilian side has been understood for some time. It led President Clinton to issue Presidential Security Directive 56 and President Bush to issue National Security Directive 44. The purpose of that second directive was to create a rapid reaction interagency force, a civilian response corps, that could be used for both conflict prevention and conflict response. It was under the control of my old office at the State Department, the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization. While SCRS was beginning to build the Civilian Response Corps, the Obama administration came in. Under the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, under Secretary Clinton, the department took the good step of making my old office a bureau and renaming it the Conflict and Stability Operations Bureau, raising its profile at state. But unfortunately, for budgetary and perhaps other reasons, they decided to take apart the Civilian Response Corps. This corps, which once numbered over 1,000, now is reduced to a handful. In other words, if we go into a major stability operation today, we will have to staff the civilian side of this contingency operation with contractors. We are no farther prepared to staff this with professionals of the U.S. government than we were 10 years ago. That's the problem. Experience has shown that we need a corps of dedicated civilian professionals in order to conduct these stabilization operations well. This is where USOCO comes in. Since the end of the war of Afghanistan, as we draw down in Afghanistan, the military is putting together smaller numbers for stability operations, but they have the ability to ramp up. We do not have something equivalent on the civilian side. We have not had that since USAID was taken apart after the Vietnam War. USOCO is a first step towards reestablishing the civilian capacity. The initial cost of this proposal is insignificant, $25 million. It can be used to put together a staff of 125 professionals who would begin to organize the civilian side for contingency operations. It would provide the first stability operations professionals ready to respond to emergencies abroad. This would put our civilian side, if this proposal is enacted, in the same situation as our military, which has ramped down the numbers but was able to ramp up in an emergency, and which has retained the know-how to conduct civilian operations, civil operations. We have created the world's greatest military, but without a professional civilian counterpart, this military will not conduct stabilization operations effectively. A small investment today will help us avoid failure tomorrow. Thank you. I apologize for going over my time.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for excellent testimony. And we will begin the questioning part. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Bowen, we have spent nearly $100 billion in Afghanistan already. However, we continue to make some of the same mistakes as we've done in Iraq. One of the lessons learned from your testimony that you pointed out is that we should begin rebuilding only after establishing sufficient security. Given the fact, as Mr. Kinzinger pointed out, that we have seen press reports this morning that the President is considering leaving no troops in Afghanistan after our withdrawal in 2014, how will this security vacuum impact our reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan based on the lessons learned in Iraq?
I think my interview with Secretary Panetta on this point shed some light on the decision-making with regard to the withdrawal from Iraq vis-a-vis what is occurring in Afghanistan. And Secretary Panetta said to me that the inability to negotiate a basis for a continuing U.S. military presence in the post-2011 Strategic Framework Agreement left the United States without important leverage in Iraq. This weakened American capacity to push for greater change within the government of Iraq. That's a lesson, I would say, from the Iraq experience, from Secretary Panetta's perspective, a one that should be listened carefully to. And thus, as we look forward to Afghanistan, that lesson ought to be kept in mind because the truth is the last quarter in Iraq has been the most devastating quarter since the summer of 2008. A lot of causes for that, certainly what's going on in Syria, but the rule of law certainly is not under control in Iraq at this moment.
And speaking of Syria, due to that ongoing bloody conflict, the infrastructure in Syria needs will continue to increase, and the U.S. might be asked to assist in Syria's reconstruction efforts in the near future. Looking beyond Afghanistan, what would you suggest, either one of you, our plan should be for a post-Assad Syria within the parameters of reconstruction efforts, and how much cost would be involved? Can you envision what those could be and what many mistakes might be repeated there?
At a minimum, we should be actively planning for participating in a multilateral stabilization and reconstruction operation in a post-Assad Syria. We should be planning now. We should have been planning for a while. Indeed, the UN, under former Syrian Minister Dari, is doing that now, and he's publicly expressed some frustration at the lack of multilateral engagement on the point. It's impossible to project the cost, but we do know the devastation in Syria is massive, and thus the stabilization and rebuilding of the country will take time. But what should be clearly on the table, and would be if there was a USOCO in existence now, is identifying the contractors, the personnel, the IT system, the oversight, how money would be managed, the controls, just to put a general rubric over it, to ensure that we avert fraud, waste, and abuse of the kind that we saw in Iraq and that we've seen in Afghanistan.
Mr. Ambassador.
I agree with Stuart that we should be planning now. We should have begun planning long ago for a possible engagement in Syria after the Assad regime falls. Whether or not we actually do that depends on many things. For example, whether the government that appears after Assad is one that's friendly to us. But we don't know, and we should be planning now for that contingency. I believe there has been some planning being done by the Office of Conflict Stabilization and Operations at the State Department for this, but I don't know how comprehensive it has been. And certainly, as Stuart said, it needs to be done in conjunction with what's being done by the UN.
And speaking, if I could interrupt you, you talk about the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations was established in November of 2011, and this bureau was preceded by the organization that you led, the Office of Coordination for Reconstruction and Stabilization. And even though the Bureau concentrates more on small crises, do you believe that we should increase the capacity of the existing Bureau within the State Department, or establish a new center, which you propose, called the U.S. Office for Contingency Operations? And wouldn't there be more redundancy and duplicative efforts between those two entities?
I think there is the possibility for duplication if USOCO is established. But here's how I look at this. The core of a successful stabilization operation on the civilian side consists of, first, planning, secondly, an integrated core of government professionals. And what you have in CSO right now is, I think, an able planning capacity and a small, competent staff. But there's no larger interagency core of professionals to do this work properly. A conscious decision was taken to reduce that core. Conceivably, it could be redone in that office, or conceivably be done with Stuart's proposal for USOCO. There does not seem to be an interest right now in the State Department for doing that. And even when I was in charge of the SCRS office at State, while we were building this, there did not seem to be a readiness on the part of the rest of the building to use it. It was something of a foreign entity in the State Department.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for good answers, and Mr. Deutsch is recognized for his questioning period.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Inspector General Bowen, you just two of the points that you flag I'd like to explore. You say that, and you spoke today about facilitating greater host country buy-in. I'd like you to speak to why that didn't happen in Iraq. And then you also recommend ensuring security before rebuilding begins. And I wonder, while that's important, I wonder the extent to which we can actually do that, and whether there's concern that it actually prolongs a conflict, prolongs the conflict and slows the reconstruction of infrastructure, state institutions, the other things that need to happen. If you could speak to both of those, and then Ambassador Herbst, as it relates to Syria, if that's the sort of thing that a USOCO would do, and that's the view that would be taken here, how is it, when is it ever relevant? When is the security situation, and who deems the security situation addressed well enough to be able to come in and do these other things? Inspector General.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. First, on the consultation point, part of it was the shift from liberate and leave, which was the pre-war plan, to occupy and rebuild, which became the policy just over 10 years ago now. A significant shift from spending $2 billion to $20 billion in the blink of an eye, and then $60 billion over 10 years. The reality was we were planning on leaving by the end of September of 2003. And thus there was no commitment to consultation with that planned short stay. When we shifted to a significant infrastructure-based rebuilding program, the plan sort of evolved within and among the U.S. contractors that were identified and was developed by the Coalition Provisional Authority. And it did not engage with the Iraqis enough. And that's their first-person testimony to me about what happened back then. But more importantly, it's something that wasn't thought of beforehand. the need to consult and the commitment to it and the deference to host country interest, capacity, and absorptive capacity in particular. What can they do? What can they sustain? On the security front, the key is ensuring sufficient security, not absolute security. So it's a proportional metric. The less secure in the environment, the smaller the project. The more secure the environment, the more substantial the project you can pursue.
Right. So just to follow up on that, in Iraq, you have the assessments being done both about security and about engagement. In the absence of USOCO, those assessments were being done by our ambassador, and those assessments were being done by the generals on the ground. So how do they, where are they on this proposal? Do they feel that they would have benefited? Do the generals, any of the generals or ambassadors who served in Iraq,
yes,
feel that they would have benefited by having this, or would
Ambassador,
it have been one?
yes, sir. Yes, Mr. Deutsch. Ambassador Crocker says this would have enabled him to operate more effectively, and he supports the idea of creating USOCO.
And when the U.S. is operating overseas, and I guess we can broaden this, Ambassador, to Syria too. The ambassador in Iraq, as we've talked about, and when the U.S. operates elsewhere, it's the ambassador who heads the civilian efforts in the country, and the commanding general then heads the defense operations. Where does, I understand what Ambassador Crocker said, where would USOCO fit into the chain of command? Is it on par with state and DOD? Is it, how does it fit?
USOCO's mission is very discrete and well-defined, and clarity will provide certainty to both the agencies and the contractors. It would be somewhat like FEMA in that the President would declare when a stabilization and reconstruction operation begins. USOCO's jurisdiction then is effectuated, and its mission is to oversee the relief and reconstruction activity in the affected country. And then upon completion of that mission as identified by the President, he would declare it over. Its reporting chain would be like mine, reporting to the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State and then the National Security Advisor.
And I only have a few seconds left. Ambassador, when would we ever hit that point in Syria? And in Afghanistan, at what point would that designation have ever been made?
In Syria, we would hit it once we decide that the situation is appropriate for us to go in. And when that point is when you have a government in Damascus or an emerging government in Damascus, which we know we can work with, and when conditions on the ground are sufficient to permit us to go in. To make that call, you would need to have very experienced professionals on the ground, certainly on the border with Syria and hopefully within Syria as well, to offer the expert political advice that our leaders need in order to make that decision. And that's why you need to have a core of professionals devoted precisely to this type of problem, because this type of problem is widespread around the world.
And without, I'm sorry, my last question, Madam Chairman. So without this core of professionals, we're not able to make the decision about when there's a government that we can work with. And shouldn't there be much more that goes into the discussion of the analysis of when to get involved, or do we always wait until there's a government that we can work with?
We should be involved as soon as we see a crisis brewing. And we should put our intelligence assets and our best professionals on the ground to develop a sense as to what's happening. Your question evinced some skepticism when you said, well, do we need these professionals in order to make these decisions? My sense is, looking at our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, it would have been very helpful if we'd had this type of professional analysis before our political leaders decided to go in this very serious way. The decisions to go in both cases were full with suppositions was proved to be false. That was mentioned by many members of the committee before we had a chance to testify.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. One of our Iraq vets, Mr. Kinzinger, is recognized.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And again, gentlemen, thank you for being here, as I mentioned in my opening statement. I think the big thing we want to know is not should we be involved in other parts of the world, but of course, how do we do it better? One of the concerns I have is in this time in Egypt, where you have this turmoil, that we're going to rush to the exits to get rid of aid and to walk away from that situation. I think it's important that in Egypt, the United States stay engaged with aid, with foreign aid, as they go through this time of instability. And I think it's, also important to recognize that in Iraq, and again, I think there were mistakes made in the post-war. Number one, I think we should have gone in with far more troops. We should have had a plan the point Saddam's statue fell. We should have had a plan for law enforcement. And frankly, we should have gotten on TV and said, if you work for the Iraqi government, come to work tomorrow because you're going to continue to have a job. And I think that in the long run cost us probably many years of fighting. And so as we look at this, something I want to explore is what's the difference between what happened in Germany and Japan post-World War II and what we saw in Iraq? Is it reasonable to expect that any kind of development aid program can succeed in a highly unstable security environment? And I'll start with you, Mr. Bone.
Well, that's a core lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan, that you must have sufficient security before engaging in substantial rebuilding, relief, reconstruction activity, development, and aid. And that cost us billions of dollars and too many lives. Indeed, we issued a report last summer that found that 719 lives were lost while those individuals were engaged in reconstruction-related activity. Better planning, better capacity, better integration among the agencies would avert the kind of fraud, waste, and abuse we've seen in Iraq. It would ensure better execution and would implement effective oversight so that the loss in blood and treasure that we've seen in Iraq, that we've seen in Afghanistan, would be averted in Syria in whatever future stabilization and reconstruction operation we engage in.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst.
Our occupations in Germany and Japan succeeded because the German governments and Japanese governments and people accepted the legitimacy of our presence. In Iraq, that was always a question. And
let me just ask you, not to interrupt, but do you believe initially when basically the Saddam statue fell, did we have the legitimacy at that point? And was it a matter of we didn't enforce laws, we didn't, we basically did the de-Baathification? Was that the problem, or do you think that was in question from the very beginning?
Given the complexities of our relationship with the Arab world, our legitimacy was in question even as Saddam's statue came down. I believe we had a chance, if we had done it smart, that we could have established some legitimacy. And if we had done it smart, we would have established law and order, which we had the capacity to do. As you stated, we would have welcomed those who had been part of the Saddam government to continue working in the government. We would not have disbanded the military the way we had. There are many fundamental mistakes that we made. Mistakes because we were not sufficiently sensitive to the culture of the location. But even had we done everything right, Iraq would have been much more difficult than Germany and Japan. But let me give you one example from Japan which helped us get it right in Japan. President Roosevelt made the critical decision not to remove the Emperor of Japan. And the Emperor of Japan said to the Japanese people, cooperate with these Americans. We had no such wisdom in Iraq.
You're suggesting we should have left Saddam Hussein as president?
No, but we took out Tojo in Japan. The emperor was a very different kettle of fish.
Understood. I understand what you're saying. Well, I thank you for that question. I think, as we look forward, I mean, Iraq, it's a very important lessons learned. We're naive if we think America's never going to have to be in this situation again in the next 50 or 100 years. And so I thank you for your hard work. Looking forward at where we're at in Afghanistan, again, as I mentioned in my opening statement, my big concern is the number 2014 for a year to withdraw from Afghanistan was pulled out of a hat, and it was pulled out for political reasons. The president wanted to put a date certain for withdrawal. I'm not going to necessarily argue I disagree, but one of my questions, though, and one of my concerns is, when you look at Afghanistan today, I think it's something like 60% of the people in Afghanistan are under the age of 20, or it's some amazingly young demographic. You have the Afghan civil society. People are waking up in Afghanistan. The Afghanistan military now basically controls its entire country. It is standing against resurgent Taliban. This is a war that has to continue, but we're on the eve of not a victory for America. I think it would be a victory for America, but a victory for the people of Afghanistan, which in 50 or 100 years, when we look back at the United States, when our grandkids or whatever are reading history books, it's going to look at this finite amount of time when there was instability in the Middle East, instability everywhere, and say, what did America do with its position of power? And it's either going to lead to a world of chaos, a world of a Chinese or a Russian leadership, or a world where America continues to be that shining city on a hill. And so I thank you all for your testimony, and I yield back.
for your service. Thank you. Mr. Connolly, Virginia is recognized.
Thank you so much. And I would say to my friend from Illinois, I appreciate his fingering some of the early mistakes that were proved catastrophic. And I would argue part of the problem is our own command structure, because we frankly infused Ambassador Bremer with way too much power to make unilateral decisions that actually undercut negotiations the military and State Department were having to try to keep the country together immediate post-invasion. And someday, Mr. Kissinger, I'd enjoy talking to you about that. I commend a book by Thomas Ricks called Fiasco, which documents this in agonizing and painful detail. Stuart, Mr. Bowen, you and I traveled to Iraq together on one of your many peregrinations. Two things, and we've got to be concise if we can do it, but two things that came up in that visit that stay with me and you and I have talked about since. One is SERP. The idea that the military was going to become an aid distribution entity. It's one thing to have some small sums to fix a problem here, to try to bolster the role of rebuilding communities, not just being seen as occupiers and invaders, but this program ballooned with very little scrutiny, and I wonder, as part of your final report, if you'd talk about that. And then the second thing is, I remember anecdotally when we were traveling in a limited way around Baghdad, if you recall this, there was the story about the water power plant or water purification plant we rebuilt or we built. The problem was that we gave no thought to the capacity of piping in Baghdad. And so we had this brand spanking, shiny new thing we could point to, and we cut a ribbon, and we turned on the switch, and tens of thousands of Baghdad water pipes burst because they weren't retrofitted to handle this new capacity. And that's what I was saying in terms of over and above the 15% of absolute waste. There were examples like that where we just didn't get it right. Now, maybe it was in haste. Maybe it was because we didn't have the right people on the project. Maybe it had to do with the coordination you're talking about. But I wonder if you just talk about that aspect of it too, not just waste.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Colony. Yes, on SERP, clearly, as our audits demonstrated, it extended far beyond its initial concept as quick-hit, urgent humanitarian need projects. That's a good idea. That's a weapon in the arsenal of the local commander to help address hearts and minds issues at the village level. What happened instead was we had projects like the Baghdad Enterprise Zone, which ballooned up to $38 million, including the painting of a mural on a blast wall for $1 million. That entire project certainly
work. That's great work if you can get it.
Well, I would deem it waste. But more importantly, it didn't advance our national security interests locally, and instead hindered them. And ultimately, the Congress responded by capping SERP projects at $1 million unless the Secretary of Defense approved, and that never happened. But the Congress shouldn't be SERP's program office. That should be done at the Pentagon, and thus in future operations, there should be a program office that carefully defines how it should be implemented and ensures training is done. That's what was also missing. On the Nazareth water treatment system, yes, you're right. It was the largest project we did in Iraq, single infrastructure project. And it, as we documented in our evaluation of it, was only operating at 20% after turnover. And it is an example of what happens when you don't carefully consult and effectively oversee and ensure proper execution at the local level. It was a project beyond their means, and as you pointed out in your opening statement, there's so much waste at the sustainment point. In other words, what the Iraqis cannot sustain. The Nazareth system is one example that's impossible to document, that the 8 billion number is a conservative number when it comes to waste. By contrast, in Erbil, the parallel water treatment project, the fourth largest project we did in Iraq, is a smashing success. It's providing fresh water to the people of the capital city of Kurdistan now. And why? Because the Kurds committed to it. And they did have a sustainment plan that they executed. Sustainment is a huge issue in any future operation.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Dr. Yoho.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Gentlemen, I appreciate your testimony. You know, we're talking about fraud, waste, and abuse, and we need to have transparency and oversight and all that, and I hear that in every meeting I come to, but we never find that person that's held accountable at the top. And, you know, with the money that we looked at spending in Iraq, $60 billion, I think is what I have, and then close to $100 billion in Afghanistan, without the oversight, it just seems, when we go back to our district, in fact, that's one of the reasons I'm here, is American people are tired of that. We've got to change our foreign policy and what we do. And the reason it worked in Japan and Germany is we beat the stink out of them and they surrendered. Nobody surrendered here. And so for us to go into a stable, non-stable government and try to rebuild, it's almost insanity, I think, or ludicrous that we do that without that clear defined goal. And now we're looking at Syria to do it again. I want to ask specifically, what do you see as the role of the American government in the Middle East? Is there a different way that we can approach the Middle East to bring stability to that area instead of going in there and bombing? People die, and then we have to look at rebuilding with the waste, fraud, and abuse. That's the one question. The other one is, if you could take us through a scenario of how money is given to this agency and how it's tracked so that we don't get into this again. And you know, unfortunately, I think we'll be involved somewhere in the future, and I'd rather not see that. I'd hate to see our young men and women go overseas. They need to stay here and build America strong. So I look forward to hearing you.
You ask a big question when you ask if we can provide stability in the Middle East. I think it's safe to say that it is beyond our means to provide stability in each and every country in the Middle East.
I agree.
And we will bankrupt ourselves if we try. We can offer an environment, we can, by prudent relations, promote stability, and that should be part of our goals. And we can also, in specific countries at specific times, make a significant difference. But we have to be very careful before we go in. We have to have excellent intelligence. We have to have goals that are sufficiently limited that we can achieve them, and goals that are consistent with the culture, political and social, of the country where we engage. And that means we have to look carefully every time before we decide to intervene. And for that, we need to have, again, a serious core of professionals and leaders with wisdom and humility.
Thank you.
And Dr. Yoho, with regard to reducing fraud, waste, and abuse in future operations, this is what USOCO would do. It would reduce the cost of preparing and executing and overseeing such operations by ensuring that there was effective planning that afforded our national command authorities options. That's what USOCO would do, and more importantly, would not rely on coordination on the ground after the operation begins, which is what occurred in Iraq and which is what occurred in Afghanistan and which didn't work. That coordination must move to interagency integration so that there is a CivMil capacity that exists before the operation begins, and that's done the work ahead of time to ensure that there are controls in place so that the projects and programs succeed and that fraud, waste, and abuse is reduced.
Okay, because I was reading in here about the Army Corps of Engineers. They did a program where they're burying the pipelines, and it was billions of dollars. And you were saying that we have to rely on better experts and things like that. I mean, how do you get better than the United States of America? You know, it's just not acceptable that we're spending this money there, and then we go back to our taxpayers and say, hey, guess what? You got to send more money in, and we're borrowing 43 cents on every dollar to send over here. And it's just, if we don't have the experts now, and they go over there, what are we doing?
Well, accountability is the key.
All right, accountability. Who's held accountable?
And that's the problem. There's no one in charge now. There was no one in charge in Iraq specifically for the rebuilding program, and when the Commission on Wartime Contracting held its hearing on Afghanistan and called state defense and aid to the table and said, who's in charge of the rebuilding program, they couldn't provide an answer. That's what USOCO would do. You know, Mike Brown was there to fire when FEMA failed. You know, there's no one there to fire now when a stabilization and reconstruction operation doesn't go well, because it's not centralized, it's not coordinated, it's not. There's no one identified with accountability for the operation. USOCO would solve that problem.
I yield back. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Yoho. Mr. Cicilline is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you again to the witnesses. You know, the contrast of the quality and service of our brave men and women in uniform compared to the conduct described in this report is really stark and very, very disturbing. And so I want to ask really three separate questions. First is, what role does the pervasive corruption in Iraq play in this reconstruction effort? You note in the report at page 104 that the United States invested over $67 million as of September 2012 in anti-corruption efforts, and despite the support for the fight against corruption, apparently little changed between 2003 and 2012, and that Iraq remains consistently one of the most corrupt countries in the world. I remember from my visit to Iraq hearing from a constituent who was part of the Rule of Law Working Group about the challenges. So I'd like to hear from you about whether or not that sort of pervasive local corruption impacts the reconstruction efforts, obviously, and our accountability that we're seeking. Second, I'd like to hear from you about the police development program. I actually saw that while I was there. Apparently wasted over $200 million to train Iraqi police that both Baghdad didn't need or want. How did that happen? How does a program that no one wants, that's that ineffective, occur? And finally, how do you conclude that this new agency would somehow provide the kind of streamlining and oversight that we have a right to expect? I think the American people see what this report reveals, and they become enraged at the kind of waste when we see crumbling infrastructure in cities and towns all across America, and we're told we don't have the resources to rebuild our own country, and we see the colossal waste that occurred in the reconstruction of Iraq, and it is, I think, it is properly a source of great rage from the American people. So I'd like you to address those three issues, please.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. The corruption issue in Iraq continues to daunt the country, to limit its capacity to grow, and to hold it back from making progress out of the situation in which it's currently mired. And as Dr. Bassett, who's the head of the Board of Supreme Audit, their chief oversight entity, told me when I interviewed him last year, corruption has become an institution in Iraq, and it takes the form of money laundering. Up to 20 to 30 billion lost annually to money laundering in Iraq by some estimates, by his estimate. And that drains the economy of its resources and keeps the majority of the population in poverty-stricken circumstances. The police development program failed to succeed because of the lack of consultation with the Minister of Interior. When we did our audit of it, we met with Minister al-Assadi, and he said to us that it was shaped and formatted in a way that didn't really meet his needs. Yet it was far down the road at that point. And upon the issuance of the audit, it began to roll back, and eventually was concluded earlier this year because of the lack of buy-in. Curiously, this late into the program, still there was a consultation problem. USOCO would address the fraud, waste, and abuse issues, the planning issues, the execution issues by ensuring accountability and transparency throughout the process. But most importantly, it would promote integration. These are civ-mil operations. If you accept that, and you accept the fact that our current system is not promoting or advancing towards greater civ-mil capacity, then I think reform is necessary. There is no other proposal on the table. There is no other office in place within the executive branch now that is advancing that interest. And that interest ultimately is tied to our national security architecture and protecting our interest in the region. Not learning from Iraq, not implementing this kind of reform will leave us worse off.
Just a follow-up question. Your report reveals that, or references an audit that was done in 2012 that concluded that roughly $1 billion was transferred out of Iraq each week via currency auctions conducted by the central bank, and up to $800 million was laundered money transferred illegally under false pretenses, and that cumulatively over the course of a year, this presents the possibility that up to $40 billion was leaving the country annually because of corruption. Do you have a sense of what percentage of that is American taxpayer money?
That is all Iraq money. That is oil and gas money flowing from the development fund from Iraq, not U.S. money. That comes from an audit by the Board of Supreme Audit, Iraq's oversight entity, that was related to me by Dr. Bassett.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Another wonderful Iraq vet, Mr. Collins, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. I think one of the things that I appreciate in this discussion with the questions on both sides is this is a dialogue. This is one of the things that I think needs to happen. And I think what's interesting, though, is coming to the table and thinking about the correlation between World War II and now. I think there's an interesting correlation. One, there is no correlation because there was different aspects of this. And going into Iraq, as we did, when you're fighting a war and trying to rebuild the place at the same time is not the best way to go about it. And also, and I think one of the statements that was made about not taking into account local interest in this, and that's something we got to look at. The question I have, though, comes, and I think it was one of his core professionals, and you keep mentioning USOCO, and we'll get to that in just a second. It was interesting to me that there's a breakdown of 75, 15, and 10 of the monies, 75% DOD, 15 aid, and then 10 state. Even in past, if you want to use past knowledge, State Department involvement usually would be higher, especially in these internals. Is that something that you see, and I want to do short because I got several things I want to get to. State Department role, especially in this issue, if we're there, does it seem like to me needs to be higher?
Yes, Mr. Collins, it does, and I especially given the fact that the State Department was given policy authority over the entire Reconstruction program. So you had the authority in one agency, yet you had the contracting capacity all in another agency, and as I saw it repeatedly on the ground, that led to friction, that led to failure.
Well, and that's what I want to follow up because, and it's disturbing me that we're throwing Syria around as quickly as we are here. And the fact of where we're at, and there has been clear evidence of a lot of things going on in Syria. And one of the statements, Ms. Hurd, I believe you made, that our job is to go and sort of paraphrase is to help those who are. And I think we've got a concern here because the very things that you're talking about when we start looking at Syria or we start, Egypt or anywhere else, is us being involved in a way militarily that's so functionally different in those environments than Iraq and Afghanistan. My concern goes back to if USOCO is implemented. How do we, one, what is the cost? What is your estimated cost to set up USOCO?
$25 million per year.
And who would it report? I've looked at your appendix and I've looked at the draft bill. Is it a standalone new agency? Yes. Where is the direct reporting?
It reports to the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense and also to the National Security Advisor for policy.
That right there I see as an issue right there. You have 3 bosses.
Yeah, I actually report to Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, and because they're CivMil, these operations, it makes sense. These are unique operations, a creature of the modern era, and
but also a direct appointment by the President, correct?
That's right.
That's what I read in your
draft
opinion. So
with Senate confirmation.
Okay, so it would be, as you made note of the FEMA issue, we'd fire that person, the President could fire that person.
That's right.
That's what we look at. As we look forward here, one of the last things that you stated in one of your lessons learned was plan in advance, plan comprehensively in an integrated fashion, and have backup plans ready to go.
Yes.
Okay, one of the issues, and I don't want to go back too far here, but is that in World War II, because it's been referenced before, if you even all the history that you would read there is that the first couple of years we were focused on winning the war. And then there became the transition as we came to the Reconstruction end. What I found troubling in Iraq is it seems to be all of a sudden we're there, oh my God, what do we do? And then how do we do this? And they were sent in to reconstruct. Now, we're not going to discuss the reasons why, but that is a concern for me. Are you looking at USOCO being an agency that is the front end to say, let's just use an example of wherever we may go into X state. For whatever reason, we decide that firm military involvement needs to be there on a large scale. Would you be trying to do, again, repeat the problems of Iraq where you go in before the fighting is over? Or are we looking at something that where there's, let's finish it, let's secure it, and then begin our rebuilding process?
It would be the latter. I mean, a key lesson from Iraq is to ensure sufficient security exists before relief and reconstruction activity pursues in earnest. But the ultimate goal of USOCO with regard to planning, Mr. Collins, is to provide national command authorities with options. In other words, a range of choices with regard to the nature of the aid that you might provide to country X. and so that you're not limited by circumstances. In Iraq, we planned to liberate and leave. We were going to be gone by September. But within 6 weeks of arriving in the country, we'd shifted to occupy and rebuild with no structure, with no system in place to sustain such an operation.
And I appreciate your work, and you have done yeoman's work here, and both have, and I appreciate that. I think the concern that I have looking forward here is implementation of USOCO, implementation of this in a what we'll call a different environment, which Iraq and Afghanistan stand alone, and then you got the smaller areas on how are we fitting in and how would that fit in long term. I think these are, Madam Chair, I think these are things that we need to discuss, especially in the Middle East as we go forward, because that is the hot spot right now in which we have to deal with. But it also concerns me deeply that we're discussing, and we throw numbers around here, we're discussing taxpayer dollars. Yes. These are dollars that men and women do not understand when we send overseas, and we don't have a clear, defined role. And I think we've had a long discussion where we've disconnected what foreign aid should be and what it should be about as to what we have seen recently. And I think that has contributed to the distrust that Americans feel, and we have got to restore that trust. And this report helps in that regard, but I think we've got to continue to follow up. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Very good, excellent points. And we have been joined by the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Engel. We're so thrilled to have you. How are we doing so far? Doing all right? Okay. Ms. Frankel of Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know,
Thank you to your son for his service.
Oh, and thank you, too, for your family and to our members who have served. So I have another family confession, which is my son also served in USAID. So this does not make me an expert either in the military or in the State Department, okay? I want to say that. But as I've tried to have many discussions with my son about this. And incidentally, he now runs a wine bar. He owns a wine bar, so you could see he's changed his direction. But here's what I want to say. First of all, you know, when I read this memo from our chair lady, thank you for this memo, one thing that really jumps out at me is that SIGIR estimates that DOD managed 75% of the Reconstruction funds. That should be a real red alert that the DOD should not be managing Reconstruction. And in fact, I mean, I am very, very proud of the military. I know you mentioned how they are professional, they're trained, but I question whether or not their training is in redevelopment. I know, you know, my son trained to be an artillery officer, and which he was, and I think that's a very different job than training to do redevelopment. So I think that one of the mistakes we made is having the Defense Department manage Reconstruction. Number two, you talked about USAID. And maybe what I would just respectfully suggest is that instead of a new bureaucracy, which is called the USOCO, I think one of the failings of government is that every time an agency doesn't seem to be doing well, instead of looking to see what the real problem is, we decide to create a new problem. Maybe, I just want to respectfully suggest, and I'd like to hear your comments, maybe USAID is not funded. Maybe USAID does not have the authority it needs. And maybe if USAID was in charge of Reconstruction rather than the military, maybe we'd have a different outcome. Now, with that said, I'm not sure that either USAID fully funded or professionalized to the degree that we would like it to be, that our Reconstruction efforts were worthwhile either in Iraq or Afghanistan, but we can save that for another day.
Oh, thank you. You raised a valid question whether or not we need a new bureaucracy or we simply use the bureaucracies we have. My opinion is that the USAID that existed 40 years ago, the USAID that was engaged in Vietnam, would have been able to do the reconstruction operation in Iraq or Afghanistan much better than we have managed to do it ourselves. Conceivably, you could recreate USAID. You'd have to infuse it with substantial resources. It's an agency based almost entirely on contractors. You'd have to hire many, many more professionals. You'd also have to institute a rather drastic cultural change. The assistance community in the United States and around the world believes very much in assistance for assistance sake, as opposed to assistance in direct support of American national interests. And there are wonderful professionals at USAID, but most of them believe that. That is not the type of culture which would do a stability operation correctly. My sense is that given how USAID functions today, and it does a wonderful job in what it does, you probably would be faster and more efficient by creating a USOCO than trying to redo it within USAID.
Did you want to?
Well, yeah, I concur with Ambassador Herbst. The reality is USAID today functions chiefly as through contracting out its work, about 80%. And so to absorb it within one agency, I think, has already been attempted at state through Ambassador Herbst's office, the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, ultimately placing it within any one agency, state, DOD, aid, will imbue the operation with that particular bureaucracy's biases. And by providing it independence, pulling it out, you're able to develop a new culture, a civ-mil culture, that ensures, Ms. Frankel, I think your key point, that a civilian leads the
Yes.
reconstruction mission. That you led with that, and I totally concur with it. And part of the motivation behind the creation of USOCO would be to ensure a civilian lead for our stabilization and reconstruction operations, rather than at each appropriation, at each supplemental, having this bidding war almost to decide who gets what share of the rebuilding money, as occurred so often in the course of the Iraq rebuilding venture.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Frankel. And Mr. DeSantis, another Florida colleague, and thank you for your service in Iraq.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thanks to witnesses. I really appreciate this, appreciate the report. The report obviously talks about that initial decision to fire de-Baathification, fire the security forces. General Petraeus, I think, was correctly critical of that. And I'm just curious, was it just assumed that those folks would not have wanted to participate in a new Iraqi government, or was there actually evidence that led us to pursue de-Baathification?
I think it was influence by the Iraqi leadership in charge and the Shia leadership that were pushing the removal of former Sunnis within the government at a level deeper than had initially been planned in pre-war plans. And that led to essentially, as has been described by a number of interviewees, to a firing of the government. And the capacity was difficult to fill and took years of training and governance assistance.
Appreciate that. In terms of the report, talks about the rule of law efforts that were undertaken, and I remember when I was there, I mean, there was a court, I remember, built in Iraqi. We'd send detainees there or whatnot, but was there any measurable success in the time and resources that we put into the rule of law while we were there? I know you said it's deteriorated recently, but from the time we started, I don't know when that. I know it was going on in 07 and 08. Was that just a failure?
No, I think the interview with Chief Justice Medhat, who was also the chair of the Higher Judicial Council in Iraq, indicated that he was satisfied with the support on a number of rule of law projects, particularly the Major Crimes Task Force and the judicial security support. 44 judges were killed in Iraq over the last 10 years, and there was much intimidation of the judiciary by terroristic elements, which prevented the effective rule of law. Over time, that security improved, and with its improvement came an overall improvement to the rule of law system.
In terms of the corruption, you know, obviously, I think in some of the mismanagement of funds, there were some serious examples of waste of taxpayer money. But is it the case that, you know, sometimes this corruption is embedded into the cultures? That is, are there not limits to what even a well-administered stabilization operation can achieve in terms of rooting out corruption? And if that's the case, specifically with respect to Iraq, I mean, do you think that that is just part of kind of what we found when we got there?
There was a culture of corruption in Iraq, and to some extent affects the region. Saddam certainly managed a formalized corrupt system of patronage. But our efforts to try and alter that didn't really alter the culture, as we've seen and as our reporting demonstrates. And as the Iraqis have told me, culture is an almost institutionalized element within the system now, and billions, tens of billions are being lost to money laundering. It's upon them, it's their duty, it's their system, it's their sovereignty now to address it, and they are beginning to address it, but too much has been lost over the last 10 years.
And then finally, in terms of the SERP project, you know, I remember that was being done when I was there, and it just seemed to me like there were some benefits, but this is just me on a very low level seeing some of this. And I didn't get a chance to read, you know, kind of how the report appraised that, but from standing here today, do you think that that was an effective use of dollars given the circumstances that these commanders were facing at the time?
Yes, Mr. DeSantis, our SERP study, our special report on SERP demonstrated significant reporting from battalion commanders about successful SERP projects when they were managed at a limited level, under $100,000. That was the initial plan. There should be 25 to 50,000, and tens of thousands of projects at that level were accomplished, I think to good effect, especially those local grants, you remember, that helped local businesses accomplish small projects. However, when they became $1 million, $5 million, $10 million projects, and then they extended beyond the life of the deployed elements, then we lost oversight, and then waste and fraud occurred.
Thank you. And then just finally, Mr. Herbst, you had mentioned about us not being prepared to do some of these operations, and so is that you would not advise us to get involved in a nation-building / stabilization type enterprise in that region right now?
I think we should be very careful before we make any decisions to go in at the present time.
Thank you. Appreciate the witnesses. I enjoyed it. Thanks, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr. DeSantis. And now we will recognize Mr. Vargas of California.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I think I figured out the button here, finally. So thank you very much.
Only supposed to learn that in your second year of service, Juan.
Usually takes me about 2 or 3, so thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I appreciate very much the testimony that you've given here today and the information you provided. You know, I think for most Americans, when you think of rebuilding, you do think of the Marshall Plan. I certainly do, and I think of it as a success. One of the things that you bring out in the report, interestingly, is the second point for your 7 final lessons learned, and that was that you begin rebuilding only after establishing sufficient security and focus first on small programs and projects. You know, the Marshall Plan began, I don't know, you may recall, it didn't begin right after the war ended. In fact, the Marshall Plan didn't begin until 2 years after the war ended, and it was because we had that fear, of course, of the spread of Soviet communism. So that's when President Truman said we're going to have this plan. It was somewhat controversial. I went back and looked at the numbers. I thought they were going to be important because I do recall the numbers being gigantic, and it turns out that we spent about $13 billion when we had a GDP then of $258 billion for the United States. So it was a rather large amount of money. There was some controversy with it, but at the same time, people generally understood, and the American people got behind it, saying, yeah, those are our allies. They're enemies now, but they're going to be allies long term. So, I mean, I appreciate the timing, but I think the second part's important, that is that that Europe was going to be friendly. Doesn't seem to be necessarily the case with Iraq and Afghanistan. Could you comment a little bit about that? Because I think that's one of the things I think that have the American people at some unease, because they don't seem like, it doesn't seem, every dollar we give to Israel, we think that's fantastic because they're friends. they're going to be friends forever. We're protecting them. You know, we're on the same wavelength on everything. Every dollar you spend in Iraq or Afghanistan, doesn't feel right.
Yes, Mr. Vargas, 2 points. One, on the Marshall Plan, you're right. We spent 2 years planning for it. And thus the element of planning to a successful stabilization, reconstruction, and rebuilding program is proven through the success of the Marshall Plan. Also interestingly, the Marshall Plan's operational entity, the ECA, reported to 2 cabinet secretaries. So there is precedent for that, as we've described for USOCO. With regard to receptivity of the local populace, there is a lesson from Iraq on that. In fact, there were 2 rebuilding programs in effect in Iraq, the one in Kurdistan, the northern 3 provinces, and then the one in the southern 15. Virtually all the projects in Kurdistan where we were welcomed, where we were well received, where we did have substantial support, were successful. Most of the projects in the South were not. I think that's reflective of your core point that ensuring stability, local buy-in, local consultation, local engagement are key to successful programs and projects.
How about you, Ambassador?
There's no question that our intervention in Germany and Japan were successful even before the Marshall Plan. And that's because, as we've all mentioned, the Japanese and the Germans accepted our presence as legitimate in the wake of their defeat. In Iraq, that was never accepted, except among the Kurds, because the Kurds had had a very bad time under Saddam Hussein's regime, and also the Kurds looked to us as natural friends. I mean, the Shia also were repressed under Saddam, but they did not necessarily see us as friends. And so our intervention in Iraq was always going to be much more difficult in the post-military phase because we were not fully accepted.
Well, and I think that's the unease I think that the American people feel. I mean, I do think that there is a real unease that we have as Americans, that we're spending so much money there, and that in a few years when we leave, they're not going to be our friends. I mean, that they're not going to, they're going to see the world very differently than we do, and our allies in the region are going to be their enemies. In other words, they're not going to line up on the same side.
I think that's the reason why we need to be cautious as we decide to engage in these countries.
Any other comment on that, Sean?
USOCO would ensure caution because it would offer options. We would not be driven by circumstances, as was the case in Iraq when we shifted from a plan to leave in 2003 to one that ended up requiring us to stay for 10 years. And USOCO would also provide accountability and transparency that I think would assuage those just concerns that the American people have about their dollars being wasted in these operations.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas, and we thank our excellent witnesses for wonderful testimony. And to conclude our subcommittee, I will just read into the record the 7 final lessons from Iraq based on the final report from the Inspector General. Number 1, create an integrated civilian military office to plan, execute, and be accountable for contingency rebuilding activities during stabilization and reconstruction operations. 2, begin rebuilding only after establishing sufficient security and focus first on small programs and projects. 3, ensure full host country engagement in program and project selection, securing commitments to share costs, possibly through loans, and agreements to sustain completed projects after their transfer. 4, establish uniform contracting, personnel, and information management systems that all SRO participants use. 5, require robust oversight of SRO activities from the operation's inception. 6, preserve and refine programs developed in Iraq, like the Commander's Emergency Response Program and the Provincial Reconstruction Team Program that produce success when used judiciously. And lastly, 7, plan in advance, plan comprehensively and in integrated fashion, and have backup plans ready to go. Excellent, gentlemen. We appreciate your testimony, and we look forward to working with you on the months ahead. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.